I threw my parents out of my house like they were nothing, because my wife told me they were destroying our life. 3 weeks later, my mother collapsed on the sidewalk outside my door, and that was the moment I realized I had destroyed my own soul. I was 36 years old the night I destroyed the two people who had loved me longer than anyone else in the world, and even now, years later, when the house is quiet and the hum of the refrigerator echoes through the kitchen at 2 in the morning, that moment still plays in my head like a scene from a movie I wish I could erase. My parents had been living with me for almost 2 years by then, ever since my father's construction company collapsed during a brutal economic downturn that wiped out nearly everything he had built over 30 years of backbreaking work. And when the bank finally took their house, I didn't hesitate to bring them into mine because in my mind it wasn't charity, it was simply repayment for the lifetime they had spent sacrificing for me. Because my mother worked late hospital shifts for decades while my father took every job he could find just so I could go to college without drowning in debt like so many other people my age, and for a long time our home felt warm and full of life, with my mom cooking on Sunday afternoons and my dad watching football in the living room while teasing me about my terrible fantasy league picks. But everything started to change after I married Emily, because when you fall in love the way I did you don't notice how slowly the atmosphere around you begins to shift. At first it was subtle things, little comments she would make late at night when we were lying in bed, telling me she felt uncomfortable in her own house, saying my parents watched her too closely, or that my mother judged her cooking, or that my father acted like she was just some temporary guest instead of his son's wife, and I remember defending them in the beginning because the accusations felt unfair. But Emily had a way of speaking that made doubt creep in like a slow leak in your mind, always calm, always emotional at the right moment, always asking questions that made me feel like I was failing her as a husband if I didn't take her side. And over time the tension in the house started building in ways that were almost invisible at first but impossible to ignore later. Small disagreements over grocery bills or kitchen space would turn into quiet cold wars where my wife would refuse to speak to my mother for days, and then she would come to me late at night with tears in her eyes asking why my family hated her so much. And the worst part was that I began noticing things I had never cared about before, like the way my mom reorganized the pantry or how my dad's TV volume filled the hallway in the evenings, and every time those tiny annoyances appeared Emily would sigh deeply and say she felt suffocated, like our marriage had no room to breathe with them living there, and slowly, so slowly I barely realized it was happening, I started seeing my parents not as the people who raised me but as obstacles standing between my wife and the peaceful life she claimed we deserved. The breaking point came one rainy Thursday night when Emily locked herself in the bathroom after an argument with my mother about a neighborhood barbecue, and through the door I could hear her sobbing while accusing my mom of humiliating her in front of the neighbors and treating her like she didn't belong in the family, and something inside me snapped under the pressure of weeks of arguments and guilt and emotional exhaustion. So I walked down the hallway into the living room where my parents were quietly watching the evening news like it was any ordinary night, and I remember my father muting the television when he saw my face because even he could tell something was terribly wrong, and with a voice that didn't even sound like it belonged to me, I told them we needed to talk, and then the words came out so cold and sharp that I still feel sick remembering them. I told them it was time for them to leave, that Emily and I needed our space, that my wife came first now, and our marriage couldn't survive with them living in the house anymore, and the silence that followed felt heavier than anything I had ever experienced in my life. My mother stared at me as if she hadn't understood the sentence at first, and then her hands began trembling while she asked quietly where they were supposed to go since they had no house, no savings left, nothing but a few suitcases of clothes. And instead of answering her question like a son should have, I hardened my heart, because admitting she was right would have meant admitting I was wrong. So I told them they were adults and they would figure something out. And the moment those words left my mouth, I saw something in my father's eyes change in a way that still haunts me today. Not anger, not shouting, just a deep tired sadness that made him look 10 years older in a matter of seconds. He stood up slowly from the couch, placed his hand on my shoulder the way he used to when I was a kid afraid of thunderstorms, and he whispered that he hoped one day I would understand the weight of the choice I had just made. And then he helped my mother gather her coat while she wiped tears from her cheeks that she tried desperately to hide from me. And within 20 minutes the two people who had given me everything in life were standing outside my front door with 2 small suitcases like strangers who had overstayed their welcome. And when the door finally closed behind them, the house felt strangely quiet, almost hollow. But Emily walked up behind me and wrapped her arms around my waist like I had just done something heroic, whispering that I had saved our marriage and that everything would finally be peaceful now. And I remember forcing a smile because that was what a loyal husband was supposed to do. But deep inside my chest something felt like it had cracked open in a way I couldn't explain, like a part of my conscience had just broken under the weight of what I'd done. And the worst part was I still convinced myself it was necessary, that love required sacrifice and difficult choices, that someday everyone would understand why I did it. But I had no idea that the moment my parents walked out of that house was the moment the slow destruction of my entire life had truly begun. At first, life seemed calmer after my parents were gone, almost unnaturally calm, like the house itself had finally exhaled after holding its breath for months, and Emily leaned into that new peace as if it were proof that everything she had said about them had been true all along. She started cooking elaborate dinners again, lighting candles on the table like we were newly married, posting smiling pictures of us online with captions about how strong relationships require healthy boundaries. And every time friends commented about how happy we looked, I felt a strange mixture of relief and guilt that I tried very hard not to examine too closely. Because the truth was that part of me knew I had crossed a line that night I forced my parents out. But admitting that would have meant facing the possibility that I had betrayed the two people who had sacrificed their entire lives for me. So instead, I clung to Emily's version of reality, like it was the only solid ground left under my feet. Weeks turned into months, and on the surface our life looked almost perfect, but beneath that calm something subtle began to change in ways that I didn't recognize until it was far too late, because Emily slowly started taking control of things she had never shown interest in before, especially our finances, explaining that she had been researching smarter ways to manage money, tax strategies, investment structures that could help us build a stronger future together, and she said it with such confidence that I felt almost foolish questioning her. So when she asked me to add her to certain accounts or sign forms that allowed her to handle transfers and paperwork, I did it without hesitation. Barely reading the documents, she slid across the kitchen table while we drank coffee in the mornings, trusting her completely because in my mind she was my partner, my wife, the person I had chosen above everyone else. At the same time she began encouraging me to distance myself from relatives who had quietly started asking questions about my parents, especially when word spread that they were living in a cheap roadside motel a few miles away after losing their home. And every time my aunt or cousin called to ask why they hadn't heard from me, Emily would grow tense and upset, saying they were turning the situation into gossip, accusing her of being the reason my parents had nowhere to go. And she would sit beside me with tears in her eyes, asking why my family seemed determined to destroy our marriage. And again I chose her side because loyalty to your spouse is supposed to mean protecting them. So I began ignoring calls, muting messages, blocking numbers one by one, until the only voices left in my daily life were Emily's and my own thoughts echoing inside a house that suddenly felt much larger and quieter than it used to. The strangest part was that every time doubt crept into my mind, Emily seemed to sense it immediately, always ready with another story about something my mother had supposedly said behind her back, or another explanation for why my parents had always secretly resented her. And over time those stories hardened into a narrative I accepted without questioning, because it was easier to believe that my parents were manipulative than to accept that I had abandoned them when they needed me the most. 3 months passed like that until one gray afternoon while I was sitting at my desk at work, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize, and when I answered it, a tired voice on the other end asked if I was the son of a woman with my mother's name, explaining that she had collapsed outside a grocery store and been taken to the hospital suffering from severe exhaustion and dehydration. And the moment I heard those words, something inside my chest tightened so violently that I had to stand up from my chair just to breathe, because I hadn't spoken to her once since the night I forced my parents out of my house. And suddenly the image of her fragile hands trembling in the living room that night came rushing back into my mind like a wave I couldn't stop. I left work immediately and drove home with my heart pounding, already preparing to go to the hospital. But the moment I walked through the front door and told Emily what had happened, her reaction stopped me cold, because instead of concern her face hardened with frustration, and she said this was exactly the kind of manipulation she had warned me about, that my parents were desperate to pull me back into their drama, and that hospitals and emergencies were the easiest way to force guilt onto someone who had finally set boundaries. And I remember standing there confused and shaken while she explained with absolute certainty that if I went running to them now, it would prove they still controlled my life, that everything we had built over the last few months would collapse the moment I gave in to their tactics again. I wish I could tell you that I ignored her and Drove straight to the hospital anyway, that some instinct deep inside me refused to let my mother lie in a hospital bed alone wondering whether her son even cared if she lived or died. But the truth is far uglier than that, because I let Emily talk me out of going, convincing myself that maybe she was right, maybe my parents were trying to manipulate me, maybe staying home was the only way to protect the fragile peace we had finally created, and that night while my mother lay under harsh hospital lights surrounded by strangers, I sat on the couch beside my wife watching television, pretending everything was normal while a quiet voice in the back of my mind kept asking a question I was too cowardly to answer. That decision should have broken something inside me completely, because no son should ever choose comfort over the possibility that his mother might be suffering alone. But instead of facing the shame, I buried it deeper, repeating Emily's explanations in my head until they sounded like truth, telling myself that love sometimes requires choosing one person above everyone else, that marriage means drawing hard lines even when it hurts, and I clung to those excuses because without them I would have had to admit that I had become the kind of man my parents never raised me to be. And while I sat there convincing myself I had done the right thing, the woman I was protecting was quietly laying the groundwork for the betrayal that would soon destroy my life completely. The collapse of my life began on an ordinary Tuesday morning that, at first, looked exactly like every other day I had lived for the past several months, and that's the part that still terrifies me when I think about it now, because disaster rarely announces itself with thunder or warning signs, it arrives quietly while you're brushing your teeth and checking the time on your phone. I remember standing in the kitchen making coffee before work, the house still dim with early morning light, Emily upstairs getting ready in the bedroom, and for a brief moment I even felt something close to peace, the kind of fragile calm that makes you believe the hard decisions you made in the past were somehow worth it. But then the knock came, loud and heavy against the front door, the kind of knock that doesn't belong to neighbors or delivery drivers, and when I opened it, I saw 2 police officers standing on my porch with expressions that instantly made my stomach drop. At first I assumed there had been some mistake in the neighborhood, maybe a burglary down the street or someone reporting suspicious activity nearby, but the moment one of them asked me to step outside so they could ask a few questions I felt a cold ripple move through my chest, and within seconds the situation turned into something I could barely process because the officer began reading accusations that sounded so absurd I actually laughed nervously at first. Accusations about financial fraud, coercion, intimidation inside my marriage, claims that I had manipulated my wife into signing legal documents transferring money through accounts she didn't understand, and for a few seconds my brain simply refused to connect those words to reality because none of it made any sense. When I finally managed to ask where these accusations were coming from, the officer glanced down at his report and said the complaint had been filed by my wife, Emily, and in that moment it felt like the ground shifted under my feet, like the entire world had tilted sideways without warning, because hearing her name attached to those words created a confusion so intense it almost felt like physical pain, and suddenly every document she had asked me to sign over the last year flashed through my mind one after another. Every form she slid across the kitchen table with casual explanations about investments or tax adjustments. Every moment I trusted her enough not to read the details because she was my wife and I believed we were building a future together. The officers continued explaining that there were already reports filed with the bank claiming suspicious transfers connected to accounts partially in her name, and that she had alleged those signatures were obtained through emotional pressure and manipulation. And as they spoke I became painfully aware of the fact that my neighbors had begun watching through their windows and half-open doors, drawn by the unmistakable sight of police standing in my driveway. And there is a particular kind of humiliation that creeps under your skin when people begin forming silent judgments about you before you even understand the accusations being thrown at your name. But the moment that shattered whatever fragile sense of reality I still had came when the front door opened behind the officers and Emily stepped outside, wearing a loose sweater and clutching a thick folder against her chest, her eyes wide with a kind of fearful expression I had never seen before, and she looked at the officers like someone who had finally found protection after months of suffering, explaining softly that she had been too afraid to report the situation earlier because she didn't know how I might react, and the way she spoke was so convincing, so perfectly controlled, that for one terrifying second I actually wondered if I had somehow misunderstood everything that had been happening in our marriage. She handed the officers the folder of documents and statements while avoiding eye contact with me, and the performance was so precise it felt almost unreal, like watching an actor deliver a role they had rehearsed 1,000 times, and when she finally looked at me there was a brief flicker in her expression, a tiny shift that lasted less than a second. But it was enough for me to see the truth hidden behind the fear she was pretending to feel, because the corner of her mouth lifted ever so slightly into a smile so cold and quiet that it felt like a blade sliding slowly between my ribs. Within hours of that moment my life began collapsing faster than I could even react, because the bank froze several of my accounts pending investigation. My employer called me into the office that same afternoon to inform me I was being suspended until the accusations were resolved. And friends who had once filled our weekends with barbecues and game nights suddenly stopped answering my calls after Emily posted a long emotional message online about surviving financial abuse inside a controlling marriage, describing herself as someone who had finally gathered the courage to expose the man who had manipulated her trust. And the comments poured in faster than I could read them. People offering support, sympathy, outrage, promising that she deserved justice and safety. Meanwhile, I sat alone at my kitchen table surrounded by legal notices and emails from lawyers demanding explanations I barely understood, replaying every moment of the past year in my mind and realizing, with growing horror, that the one person who could have cleared everything up with a single honest sentence was the same person who had carefully built the trap now tightening around my life. And as the days passed and more accusations surfaced, I felt my reputation dissolving piece by piece, like watching a building collapse in slow motion while you're still trapped inside it. And the most terrifying realization of all slowly crept into my thoughts late at night when the house felt unbearably quiet, because in choosing Emily over everyone else, I had pushed away every single person who might have stood beside me when the world started believing I was the monster she was describing. The next few weeks became the darkest stretch of my life, the kind of slow suffocation where every morning you wake up hoping the nightmare will somehow reset itself, only to realize the world still believes the worst version of you. Every single day brought something new crashing down on my head. Another legal letter slipped under the door, another email from my employer confirming my suspension was still under review, another message from someone I once called a friend telling me they didn't want to be involved in whatever was going on. And the silence in the house grew heavier with each passing night because Emily was gone by then, not just emotionally but physically too, having packed most of her belongings and disappeared into a new apartment while filing for divorce and publicly portraying herself as a woman who had finally escaped a manipulative husband. And I watched that story spread across social media like wildfire while strangers who had never met me filled comment sections with words like monster, abuser, fraud. And somehow the worst part wasn't even the accusations themselves but the terrifying realization that on paper the situation looked exactly like she described, because the documents I had blindly signed months earlier placed financial responsibility squarely on my shoulders while protecting her from legal consequences. And every lawyer I spoke to said the same cold sentence in different words, proving the truth might be possible, but clearing my reputation completely could take years, if it happened at all. Nights became the hardest, because that's when the noise of the outside world faded and my thoughts had nowhere to hide, and I would lie awake staring at the ceiling replaying every moment of the past year in brutal detail, watching the warning signs I ignored and the choices I made stack up like bricks in a wall that had slowly trapped me inside my own destruction. And inevitably my mind would drift back to the night I forced my parents out of the house, to my mother's trembling voice asking where they would go and my father's quiet hand on my shoulder telling me he hoped I would understand one day what I had done, and the shame of that memory would press down on my chest so hard it felt like I could barely breathe, because by then I knew something I hadn't allowed myself to admit before. I had thrown away the only people who would have stood beside me when everything fell apart. But even knowing that, I was too ashamed to reach out to them, too afraid to hear the pain in their voices or face the possibility that they might have finally given up on me the same way I had given up on them. So instead I stayed trapped inside the empty house, surrounded by unopened legal envelopes and bills piling up on the kitchen table, waiting for the next piece of my life to collapse. Then one gray afternoon, while I was sitting in the living room staring blankly at a stack of paperwork I could barely understand anymore, there was a knock at the front door, a quiet knock this time, not the heavy authoritative pounding the police had used weeks earlier, and for a moment I just sat there frozen because I had started to associate that sound with bad news. But eventually I forced myself to stand and walk down the hallway, and the moment I opened the door my breath caught in my throat so suddenly it felt like someone had punched me in the chest, because standing there on the porch were the two people I had betrayed more cruelly than anyone else in my life. My father looked thinner than I remembered, his shoulders slightly hunched as if the past few months had aged him years, and beside him my mother held a small paper grocery bag in both hands the way she used to when bringing dinner home after late shifts at the hospital. And for a few seconds none of us spoke because the weight of everything that had happened between us filled the air like a storm cloud ready to burst, and I could feel my throat tightening with words I didn't know how to say, apologies that suddenly felt too small for the damage I had caused. Before I could even open my mouth, my father stepped forward slightly and spoke in the same calm voice he had always used when I was younger and afraid of something I didn't understand, telling me he had heard about the accusations through an old friend who still worked at the bank, and that he had spent the last week quietly contacting people, reviewing records, tracing where certain transfers actually moved because something about the situation didn't make sense to him. And then he said a sentence that broke something deep inside my chest. Despite everything I had done to them, he refused to believe his son was the kind of man the world was calling him. My mother didn't say much at first. She simply stepped inside the house and placed the grocery bag on the kitchen counter like she had done thousands of times throughout my life, gently explaining that she brought some food because she thought I probably hadn't been eating properly with everything going on, and that small act, so simple, so ordinary, felt more devastating than any accusation Emily had thrown at me, because it showed a kind of love I had completely failed to deserve. I stood there in the doorway shaking, the weight of my own guilt pressing down harder than any lawsuit or rumor ever could, realizing in that quiet moment that the two people I had pushed out of my life were the same. Two people who had come back the second they heard I might be drowning, and whatever pride or stubbornness I had been clinging to finally began crumbling under the unbearable truth of what I had done. The truth eventually came out, but not in the triumphant way people imagine when justice finally surfaces, because by the time the evidence finally began untangling the lies Emily had built around me, my life had already been dragged through months of humiliation that no courtroom victory could erase. It started slowly, piece by painful piece, as my father worked with my lawyer late into the nights at our kitchen table reviewing bank records, timestamps, digital signatures, and transaction logs. The kind of dull technical details that most people would never have the patience to examine. But my father treated every line like it was a thread leading back to the truth, and I remember watching him from across the room one night, realizing how strange it felt that the same man I had thrown out of my home like an inconvenience was now fighting harder for my future than I had ever fought for his dignity. Over weeks the pattern began to reveal itself, showing how Emily had carefully moved money through accounts connected to my name while documenting everything in a way that made it appear as if I had orchestrated the entire process. And the deeper the investigation went, the more horrifying the picture became, because it turned out she had been planning her exit long before the accusations ever reached the police, quietly transferring funds into protected accounts and preparing statements that framed her as the victim of financial manipulation. And when the evidence finally reached the court, the story she had told the world started collapsing under its own weight. But by then the damage had already spread far beyond legal documents, because rumors travel faster than truth ever will. And even after investigators acknowledged inconsistencies in her claims, the whispers in the neighborhood didn't suddenly disappear, my job didn't magically return, and the savings I had spent years building were already drained by legal fees and frozen accounts, leaving behind a hollow shell of the life I once believed was secure. Emily herself vanished long before the final hearings concluded, disappearing from the city entirely once the legal pressure began turning in her direction, leaving behind nothing but a forwarding address through her attorney and a silence that somehow felt colder than the betrayal itself. And when the judge finally dismissed the accusations tied to my name, there was no applause, no dramatic moment of victory, just the quiet sound of a gavel and a room full of people who still looked at me like they weren't entirely sure what to believe. That night after the final hearing, my parents and I returned to the house that had once felt so full of certainty and now felt like a monument to every mistake I had made. And I remember sitting at the kitchen table staring at the same spot where I had signed those documents months earlier, realizing how easily trust can be turned into a weapon when it's placed in the wrong hands. My mother made tea the way she used to when I was younger and couldn't sleep before school exams, moving quietly around the kitchen while my father sat across from me with the same calm patience he had shown throughout the entire nightmare. And suddenly the weight of everything I had done crashed down on me so hard I couldn't hold it back anymore. Because in that moment the lawsuits, the betrayal, the public humiliation all faded behind one unbearable truth. I had abandoned the two people who had never abandoned me. The tears came before I could stop them, heavy and uncontrollable, and I broke down right there at the table like a child, apologizing in broken sentences that barely made sense, telling them I was sorry for the night I forced them out, sorry for the months I ignored them, sorry for believing someone else's voice over the people who had loved me since the day I was born. And I expected anger or disappointment, or at least a silence that confirmed I had gone too far to ever repair the damage. But my mother simply placed her hand over mine the same way she had done in the courtroom every day while the accusations were being read aloud, and my father leaned forward slightly and told me something I will carry with me for the rest of my life, that a parent's love doesn't vanish just because their child makes terrible mistakes. The worst part of the entire experience wasn't losing money, or watching my reputation collapse, or even realizing how carefully Emily had planned to destroy me. It was understanding that the only reason I was still standing at all was because the people I had rejected refused to treat me the way I treated them. Years have passed since those days, and life slowly rebuilt itself in quieter ways. But every now and then when I sit alone at night, I still hear the echo of the door closing the night I told my parents to leave. And I understand something now that I didn't understand then, something that hurts more with every passing year. Because the truth isn't just that my wife betrayed me. The truth is that long before she did that, I had already betrayed my own blood first. I trusted the voice that fed my pride, and silenced the voices that truly loved me. By the time I finally understood the truth, my life was already lying in ruins, and the same hands I pushed away were the ones pulling me out of the wreckage. If there is someone in your life who refuses to leave when you are at your worst, please, never push them away. Because losing the wrong person only breaks your heart, but betraying the right ones kills something inside your soul forever. If this story moved you, please like, share, and comment to let others hear it too. And if you have a story the world needs to hear, subscribe to the channel, Betrayed by Blood. Your story might be the next one told.